So there was this kind of passionate love affair that many of the rabbis had to the Torah, and they had to be reminded not to neglect worldly concerns. But there was also a sense that the goal of Talmud Torah wasn't just to commune with God, but should also be transformative. There's a lovely passage that says that the Torah has 613 commandments. We mentioned that number, 613, which is divided into 365 negative commandments. You shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, and 248 positive commandments. Remember the Sabbath day, eat matzah, unleavened bread on Passover. And in the Talmud itself, it links those numbers, 365 and 248, to the 365 days of a solar year and the 248 parts of a human body. Now, there are about 365 days in a solar year. I've asked my medical friends if they know of the number 248, and they said that, that's a stretch. But the idea behind the Midrash of 365 days and 248 parts of the body is that what studying Torah should be is this transformative experience of making our entire body reflect the will of God all the time, every moment of every day. We should be walking Torahs with our entire body all of the time. This may be, and I say this speculatively, this may be a little bit of a polemic with Christianity, where in Christianity you've got Jesus, who is the embodiment of God, one person. Whereas the ideal for Rabbinic Judaism is that all Jews, all Rabbinic Jews, should not be the embodiment of God, but the embodiment of God's will as expressed through the Torah. Okay, now we're going to move from talking about the centrality and importance of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah to a brief description of some of the books on the rabbinic bookshelf. Again, rabbinic literature, let's push it way back. The sources for rabbinic literature may start in the 1st or even 2nd century BCE and probably go till the 7th, 8th century of the Common Era. The books themselves begin in the 3rd century. But a 3rd century book that was redacted and edited, and it didn't really have 2 covers, but it was sealed. It has a beginning and an end. A 3rd century book may have traditions that are several centuries older than the book itself. The first literary production of Rabbinic Judaism that I want to talk about is the Mishnah. The Mishnah literally means repetition, because you repeat. When you learn something, you do it by repeating it over and over through memorization, right? You have to remember that we're talking about 2,000 years ago when they didn't have computer texts, computers at all, and the process of learning in an oral culture was through the repetition. The Mishnah is a codex of Jewish law that was compiled by Yehuda Hanasi, or Judah the Prince, around the year 220 of the Common Era. Judah the Prince, the person who redacted this text, was the leader both in a religious sense and in a political sense of that community of Jews that was still in the land of Israel. The Mishnah is a codex of Jewish law, and it's not a law book. What's the difference? A law book has the laws. It tells you what to do, X, Y, and Z. What's distinctive about the Mishnah is that it retains minority opinions and dissenting opinions. Every once in a while, it also throws in some stories, but very infrequently. The Mishnah is much more halachic than agadic. Okay? The Mishnah retains these minority opinions and dissenting opinions because it says explicitly that maybe sometime in the future there may arise a court whose justices are intelligent and of greater intelligence than they are, and of greater number than they are perhaps, and they'll want to rely on the minority opinions or even on the dissenting opinions, because as historical circumstances change, sometimes laws also need to change in order to address the needs of that present population. The Mishnah itself is arranged conceptually, unlike the appearance of many of the laws throughout the Torah, so that you've got 6 orders of the Mishnah, There's a song that is sung after the Passover Seder, One Who Knows. And it goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 13. Apparently, this started out as a wedding song, as a drinking song. And so people would go around the table and say, okay, I've got the number 1, there's 1 guy. Okay, the next person has 2. Okay, there are 2 tablets, right? In the Decalogue, you've got 2 tablets. And the person that couldn't think of the next number would have to drink. So when they got to 6, it was the 6 orders of the Mishnah. They have to do with sacrificial issues in the temple, purity issues, criminal law, laws related to women, laws related to agriculture, and laws related to the holidays. So those are the 6 general divisions of the Mishnah. When the laws in the Mishnah are recorded, they're not usually recorded with the biblical verse that justifies the law. So we call this unjustified law. Doesn't mean that there is no reason. It just means that there is no reason that is attached to the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah, it just tells you what to do and it tells you what to do, and then it tells you what the other rabbi who disagrees with the first rabbi, which is very common, right, suggests you should do instead. Around 250, there was an appendix to the Mishnah that was put at the end of the 4th division, which was about criminal law. Torts. At the very conclusion, you've got this section called Avot, or the fathers, the founders. Abba is father in Hebrew, in Aramaic actually, and Avot in Hebrew is fathers. That section called fathers or founders is exclusively agadic. That statement that I started with at the beginning, that Shimon the righteous one, said that the world stands on 3 things, on Torah, on worship, and on acts of loving kindness, that is Agadah found in Pirkei Avot, the chapters of our fathers. Avot served as a kind of introduction to the Mishnah. The Mishnah just presents the laws, but it doesn't give you any justification for the authority of the rabbis to be promoting those laws. So the way that Avot opens up is by saying that Moses received the Torah, and here they mean the oral Torah, what's being included in the Mishnah. So Moses received that Torah at Mount Sinai, and Moses transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua transmitted it to Ploni, and Ploni transmitted it to Almoni, right? Joe Schmo. Ploni Almoni is Joe Schmo in Hebrew. And eventually it came down to Shimon, the righteous one, and then to Hillel, who we'll talk about at some point in our lecture, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and the rabbis who make up Rabbinic Judaism. So there is an unbroken chain of tradition from Sinai all the way down to Rabbinic Jews that provides the authority for their interpretation of the Torah about things that seem to not sit quite so well with a plain sense reading of the Torah, as well as issues that the Torah doesn't even talk about. For instance, the Torah doesn't talk about how to kill an animal according to the laws of keeping kosher or kashrut. So if you need to, right? We know that we're only supposed to eat certain kinds of animals. Well, you have to eat them once they're dead and once the blood has been drained out of them. How do you do it? That information is found in the Mishnah. It fills in the spaces where the Bible doesn't seem to be so interested in in fleshing out the details. Fleshing out, so to speak. Okay? So the Hebrew Bible is relatively small. The Mishnah is much bigger. Much bigger. And what the function of Pirkei Avot is to link this idea of the oral Torah back to the same source and divine authority as the written Torah in hoary antiquity at Mount Sinai when the Israelites left Egypt. The Mishnah. The Mishnah is that first layer, and it was the curriculum that students who were studying to become masters of the tradition first learned. But in the process of learning the Mishnah, new questions came up. New ways of looking at the law or looking at the text came up. And those conversations about how to understand the Mishnah and why this law is authoritative and what biblical verse does this law stem from, those conversations were recorded and later edited into what is called the Gemara. The Gemara is an Aramaic word that means learning. Mishnah is a Hebrew word that means learning. Gemara is an Aramaic word, which was the common language of the land of Israel for hundreds and hundreds of years during this period. It also means learning. The Mishnah plus the Gemara equals the Talmud. The Talmud is a big bookshelf of the Mishnah at its base, and then conversations that start about the Mishnah, but then go off in a kind of stream of consciousness way to all kinds of different ideas and different topics. For instance, if we have a law in the Mishnah about how to slit an animal's throat from the front so that it bleeds quickly and not from the back, you can then go, the Gemara might then ask, okay, well, what biblical verse does this come from? So Rabbi Yossi says it comes from the biblical verse such and such. Oh, but Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Okay, and then we'll resolve that problem. And since we introduced Rabbi Yehuda, you know what? Rabbi Yehuda was known for wearing pink and purple on the Sabbath for these reasons. So then we'll go into a whole series of traditions about what these individual rabbis did on the Sabbath that's totally idiosyncratic and has nothing to do with the laws of where to slice an animal's throat in order for kosher butchering. So it's this kind of stream of consciousness, unique literature, and that's part of the reason why it's so engrossing. It pulls you in because you want to know where it's going to go, because you can't ever see around the corner in a Talmudic sugya or a Talmudic passage. There are two Gemaras. There were two sets of conversations that happened around the Mishnah. One set of conversations happened in the land of Israel, probably in Tiberias and in northern Israel, but that Gemara is called, or that Talmud is called the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. And it's called the Jerusalem Talmud because of the centrality and importance and holiness of Jerusalem to the entire Jewish people. So there's the Jerusalem Talmud, but the more authoritative Talmud for purposes of deciding the halakha was created in Babylonia. After the Great Revolt in 70, there were many Jews that left the land of Israel, and even more so 70 years later. When we talk about Messianism, we're going to talk about the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt happened, it started in 132, about 62 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. Because about 60 years after, there was this notion that just like 70 years after the First Temple had been destroyed, it was rebuilt, so too God will somehow create a situation where 70 years after the Second Temple, the Third Temple will be rebuilt. And so a few rabbis, but one particularly prominent rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, supported Bar Kokhba as a messiah, as the person to militarily lead the Jews against the Roman occupation. Didn't work out so well. And as a result of this failed revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 135, even more Jews left the land of Israel and emigrated to the Jewish community in Babylonia that had been there since the destruction of the First Temple and the exile, the Babylonian exile, already back in the 6th century BCE. So there was a long-standing Babylonian community. By the way, it was at that point, during the Bar Kokhba revolt, that the Romans got so fed up with the Jews that they decided to change the name of the land of Israel in Judea to echo the Israelites' ancient enemies, the Philistines. That's how that landmass got the name Palestine. Citia Palestina was what the Romans called it, just to erase any trace of a Jewish presence and to kind of dig it into the Jews that they were naming it after the biblical Israelites' ancient enemies, the Philistines. So you've got the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. In terms of quantity, my thumbnail represents the amount of quantity of the Mishnah, and the rest of my wingspan is Gemara. There's much more Gemara than there is to the Mishnah. The Mishnah I can hold in my hand. Okay? It's bigger than the Hebrew Bible, but I can still hold it in my hand. I'm not nearly big enough or strong enough to hold the entire Talmud.